What if the most shocking escape from a harsh medieval world wasn't a knight in shining armor but a simple nun? What if a life behind cloister walls, between the 11th and 15th centuries, offered freedoms and opportunities few women outside knew? Number 7. Escaping the harsh realities of medieval marriage and childbirth. For many women in the medieval period, life's trajectory was often set from a very young age, charting a course directly toward matrimony and its many responsibilities. The world outside the convent walls for most women meant an inevitable journey into marriage, a social contract that was far more about alliances, property, and lineage than it was about personal affection or choice. A young woman, sometimes as young as 12 years old, could find herself betrothed, her future partner chosen by her parents or guardians, often for reasons entirely unrelated to her own desires. The age of consent varied across different regions and centuries, but it was not uncommon for girls to be married shortly after puberty, and sometimes even before, with the expectation that the marriage would be consummated once they were deemed physically mature enough. This early entry into adult life meant that many girls transitioned directly from their childhood homes to managing a household, often with a husband significantly older than themselves. Once married, a woman's legal identity largely merged with that of her husband. She became, in many legal systems, a chattel, an extension of her husband's property. Her dowry, the wealth or goods she brought into the marriage from her family, ceased to be hers independently and instead became part of the joint estate managed by her husband. While some regional variations existed, and dower rights might provide for a widow, the general rule was that married women held little legal autonomy, could not typically own property in their own name, initiate legal proceedings independently, or conduct business without their husband's consent. Their opinions, while perhaps valued in the domestic sphere, carried little weight in the public or legal realms. The daily life of a married woman was primarily dictated by household management, whether that meant overseeing servants in a noble household or toiling alongside her husband in the fields as a peasant. Her worth was often measured by her ability to produce children, especially male heirs, and to maintain the domestic order. Pressure to bear children was immense, and for good reason given the high rates of infant and child mortality. Families needed many children to ensure some would survive to adulthood, continue the lineage, and provide labor. This societal expectation placed an enormous burden on women's bodies. Childbirth in the medieval era was an incredibly perilous undertaking. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and hygiene standards were virtually non-existent. Delivery often took place in cramped, unsterile conditions, attended by local midwives whose practices were based on traditional knowledge, some effective, some less so. Records from medieval cemeteries, meticulously studied by modern demographers, consistently reveal a stark peak in deaths among women during their prime childbearing years, typically between the ages of 20 and 35. A woman might endure multiple pregnancies, often in quick succession, each one risking her life from complications like hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, or puerperal fever. Surviving one birth offered no guarantee for the next, and many women died after their first or second child. Historical accounts and legal documents occasionally hint at the emotional and physical toll this took, but the grim reality was that the potential for a fatal childbirth was an ever-present shadow over a married woman's life. Beyond the physical dangers, marriage could also entail a significant loss of personal freedom and identity. A woman's life was tied to her husband's social standing, his economic fortunes, and his personal character. If he was kind and fair, her life might be tolerable. If he was cruel, abusive, or simply neglectful, she had very little recourse. Divorce was exceptionally rare, often requiring special dispensation from the church, and typically only granted for severe reasons like impotence or consanguinity. Separations were sometimes possible, but they offered little practical relief for women who might lose their economic support. Furthermore, The constant demands of child-rearing and domestic labor from dawn until dusk often left little time for personal reflection, intellectual pursuits, or spiritual devotion beyond what could be squeezed into the cracks of a demanding day. For many women, their identities became solely defined by their roles as wife and mother, with little opportunity to cultivate individual talents or pursue personal ambitions. Their sphere of influence rarely extended beyond the immediate family unit, and perhaps a small circle of neighbors or relatives. In stark contrast, entering a convent offered a radical alternative to this predetermined life path. A woman who took her vows effectively bypassed the entire system of medieval marriage. She became, in a spiritual sense, a bride of Christ, a symbolic union that freed her from the temporal obligations and dangers of a worldly husband. Her body became her own, consecrated to God, and therefore not subject to the physical demands of procreation. This meant she entirely avoided the constant life-threatening peril of childbirth, an escape from a leading cause of female mortality in the period. For women who harbored fears of the birthing bed or who had witnessed the tragic deaths of mothers or sisters, the convent offered a sanctuary, a secure space, where their physical integrity remained their own. The freedom from the physical and emotional burdens of repeated pregnancies allowed women to preserve their health and vitality in ways that married women could not. Furthermore, a nun retained her individual legal and spiritual identity in a way that was often impossible for married women. While she submitted to the authority of the abbess and the monastic rule, her name remained her own, and she was not subsumed into another person's identity. She often brought a dowry to the convent, but this dowry was not then controlled by a husband. Instead, it became part of the convent's collective wealth, securing her place and supporting the community as a whole. This economic arrangement provided her with security without sacrificing her autonomy. Within the convent, disputes were resolved internally, and nuns were protected from the arbitrary whims or potential cruelty of a husband. The very structure of monastic life fostered a sense of sisterhood and mutual respect, which offered an alternative to the often hierarchical and sometimes oppressive dynamics of patriarchal secular households. The decision to enter a convent was not always entirely voluntary, especially for younger girls sent by their families, sometimes due to a surplus of daughters or as a means of providing for a younger sibling without a dowry. However, even for those who initially entered without full personal conviction, the monastic life could nonetheless represent a significant improvement over the alternatives. For women who genuinely desired a spiritual path, it offered a profound sense of purpose that transcended the domestic sphere. For others, it might have been a pragmatic choice, offering a safe haven from a society where women often had few options beyond marriage or a precarious existence as a single woman. Convent provided a guaranteed existence, stable food, shelter, and community support, which were far from guaranteed for many women outside its walls, particularly those who lacked family protection or sufficient resources. In essence, a nun's life represented a deliberate or de facto rejection of the traditional female role in medieval society. It offered an institutionalized escape from the pervasive risks and constraints of marriage, particularly the existential threat of childbirth. While monastic life came with its own set of rules and renunciations, it granted women a unique form of bodily autonomy and identity preservation, opportunities that were largely unavailable to their married counterparts. The choice or the circumstances that led to the choice of becoming a nun provided a distinct path away from a life fraught with physical danger and legal subservience, allowing women to forge a different kind of existence, one often characterized by greater security and individual integrity. Number 6, a haven for education and intellectual pursuits. For the vast majority of women living in the medieval world, the doors to formal education were firmly closed. Literacy was a rare commodity, largely confined to the clergy and a small segment of the male aristocracy. Peasant girls who formed the overwhelming majority of the population, were expected to learn the practical skills necessary for survival and household management: cooking, spinning, weaving, tending animals, cultivating small gardens, and caring for younger siblings. Their days were filled with manual labor, and their education was entirely informal, passed down orally or through direct demonstration from their mothers and grandmothers. There was no time, nor any perceived need, for them to learn to read or write. Their wisdom was tied to their practical abilities, their knowledge of local remedies, and their efficiency in running a household. Even among the elite, daughters of nobles or wealthy merchants might receive some instruction, but it was typically tailored to their expected roles as wives and mothers. They might learn needlework, music, some basic arithmetic for household accounts, and perhaps rudimentary Latin for prayers. However, reading and writing in a profound, scholarly sense, let alone engaging with complex texts or writing original compositions, was highly unusual. Their lives revolve around managing large households, hosting guests, overseeing servants, and raising children. Access to books was limited, and private tutors were a luxury primarily for boys destined for legal, ecclesiastical, or administrative careers. The idea of a woman pursuing knowledge for its own sake or contributing to intellectual discourse was largely foreign to the secular world of the time. The very concept of female scholarship was often met with skepticism or outright disapproval. Within the cloister, however, a fundamentally different reality unfolded. Monastic life, by its very nature, required a degree of literacy. Nuns needed to be able to read the divine office, the daily cycle of prayers and psalms, as well as the scriptures and the rule of their order, whether Benedictine, Cistercian, or another. This necessity meant that convents were often centers of learning for women, providing an educational opportunity that was virtually unparalleled outside their walls. Novices were taught to read and write, typically in Latin, the universal language of scholarship and the church. This basic instruction laid the groundwork for further intellectual development. Libraries, often quite substantial for the time, were common features of convents. These collections contained not only liturgical texts, but also commentaries, lives of saints, theological treatises, philosophical works, and sometimes even classical literature. Convents often maintained scriptoriums, dedicated spaces where nuns engaged in the laborious but vital work of copying manuscripts. This was not merely rote transcription. It required careful attention to detail, a deep understanding of the Latin language, and often an artistic flair for illumination. Nuns copied sacred texts, historical chronicles, and even secular works, thereby preserving knowledge and disseminating learning. The act of copying itself was considered a form of prayer and spiritual discipline, but it also honed intellectual skills, sharpened focus, and deepened engagement with the texts. Some convents became renowned for their scriptoriums, attracting women with a talent for calligraphy and artistry, and their work contributed significantly to the preservation of medieval literature and thought. Beyond copying, some nuns went on to become scholars, authors, and composers in their own right, achieving a level of intellectual prominence that would have been almost impossible for women outside the monastic setting. One celebrated example is Hutzliet of Gandersheim, a 10th century Benedictine canoness. She is considered the first female poet of the German lands, and one of the first known female dramatists. Hutzliet composed Latin dramas, epic poems, and historical chronicles, demonstrating a profound knowledge of classical literature and theology. Her plays, written in the style of Terence but with Christian themes, explored moral dilemmas and the lives of saints. She was educated within the convent, and her work suggests a highly sophisticated intellectual environment at Gandersheim. Her ability to compose such complex and learned works points to the rigorous education available to women within the convent. Another towering figure of medieval female intellect was Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess, while her primary fame rests on her mystical visions and prophetic writings. Hildegard was also a polymath who composed groundbreaking liturgical music, wrote extensive treatises on natural history and medicine, and engaged in voluminous correspondence with emperors, popes, and kings. Her works, like Civius, Physica, and Causae et Curae, demonstrate an astonishing breadth of knowledge and a powerful intellect, all cultivated within the monastic framework. She established her own independent monastery, Rupertsberg, which became a thriving center of spiritual and intellectual life. Convent provided the stability, resources, and intellectual freedom necessary for her extraordinary output. These examples, while exceptional, illustrate the potential for intellectual flourishing within convent walls. Nuns had access to libraries, quiet spaces for study, and the guidance of learned sisters. The monastic routine, with its emphasis on prayer, reading, and contemplation, naturally fostered an environment conducive to intellectual pursuits. Debates and discussions on theological and philosophical matters were common. Some convents even had a tradition of female leadership who themselves were highly educated and encouraged learning among their community. They were often responsible for teaching the younger nuns, ensuring the continuity of knowledge and fostering a culture of literacy and scholarship. Furthermore, monastic life offered a precious commodity for intellectual work. Time, free from the endless domestic chores, social obligations, and child-rearing demands that consumed the lives of secular women. Nuns had dedicated hours for reading, writing, and contemplation. The regular rhythm of the divine office punctuated their days, but between prayers, there were significant periods for study, manuscript work, or personal spiritual reflection. This structured environment provided the mental space and physical resources for intellectual development that was largely denied to women in the outside world. The convent acted as a protected enclosure, where women's minds, not just their souls, could be nurtured and grow. For women with intellectual inclinations, a desire to learn, or a talent for literary or scholarly work, the cloister represented a unique and often the only pathway to pursuing such interests. It was a space where female intellect was not merely tolerated, but often celebrated and actively cultivated. Number 5. A. Built-in support system and community. Life in the medieval secular world, particularly for women, could often be characterized by isolation and vulnerability. While families and villages provided some degree of support, the extended network of care and consistent assistance was not always guaranteed. For women, their fortunes were often tied to their immediate family unit, and if that unit was disrupted by death, illness, or economic hardship, they could find themselves in precarious circumstances. Widows, for example, frequently faced severe economic distress and social ostracization. Without a husband to manage property or provide an income, they often struggled to maintain their households, particularly if they had young children. They might be forced to remarry quickly, often to someone undesirable, or depend on the charity of relatives, which could come with its own set of indignities and obligations. Single women beyond their immediate family had even fewer social safety nets and faced significant challenges in navigating a world largely structured around patriarchal family units. Even within families, relationships could be strained by economic pressures, power dynamics, or personal conflicts. Feuds between neighbors or within larger kinship groups were not uncommon, and they could leave individuals feeling isolated and without recourse. Illness and old age presented significant hardships, as informal care depended heavily on the willingness and capacity of family members who might themselves be struggling. There were no public hospitals or widespread social welfare programs in the modern sense. Support was often contingent on immediate family bonds, which could be fragile or insufficient in times of crisis. concept of community outside the convent often meant a group of individuals linked by geography or familial ties, rather than a formalized system of mutual aid and emotional support. Within the convent walls, however, a woman entered a pre-existing, formalized, and highly structured community of sisters. This was not merely a collection of individuals living together, but a deliberate, spiritual family bound by shared vows, a common rule, and a collective purpose. From the moment a novice joined, she became part of this established network, providing an immediate and lasting sense of belonging. The very design of monastic life fostered mutual reliance and collective responsibility. Nuns lived, worked, and prayed together, sharing resources, joys, and burdens. There was no need to worry about being alone in old age or illness. The community was explicitly obligated to provide care for its members. Communal living arrangements meant that meals were eaten together in the refectory, prayers were recited together in the chapel, and work, whether in the scriptorium, garden, or infirmary, was often performed collectively. This shared rhythm of life fostered deep bonds of sisterhood. If a nun fell ill, she was cared for in the infirmary, a dedicated space for the sick, where fellow nuns, often with knowledge of herbal remedies cultivated in the convent's own garden, would attend to her needs. This level of institutionalized care was a stark contrast to the often ad hoc and limited care available in the secular world. The infirmary was not just a place for physical healing, but also a space for spiritual and emotional support, where the sick sister was comforted and encouraged by her community. Beyond physical care, the convent provided immense emotional and spiritual support. Life within the cloister was challenging, demanding discipline, obedience, and self-sacrifice. However, facing these challenges alongside a community of women who understood and shared the same path offered profound psychological security. If a nun struggled with her vows, experienced spiritual doubts, or simply felt a moment of loneliness, there were always sisters, an older nun, or the abbess to turn to for guidance, comfort, and understanding. The shared commitment to a spiritual life meant that sisters could support each other in their pursuit of holiness, offering encouragement during times of temptation or spiritual aridity. Confession and spiritual direction were readily available from the community's priest or directly from the abbess, providing an outlet for internal struggles and anxieties. The absence of many of the competitive pressures found in secular society also contributed to a more harmonious community. Nuns were not competing for marriage partners, vying for control over family property, or seeking social status in the same way as women outside. Their shared goal was spiritual salvation and the welfare of the community. This environment fostered a different kind of female relationship, one based on shared purpose and mutual support rather than rivalry. Historical records and monastic rules often emphasize the importance of charity, humility, and sisterly love, prescribing behaviors that encouraged cooperation and discouraged conflict. While disagreements naturally rose, the structured nature of monastic life provided mechanisms for resolving them, such as appeals to the abbess or chapter meetings. Furthermore, convents often became a refuge for women who, for various reasons, did not fit neatly into secular society's expectations. These might include women who were widowed young, those with physical disabilities, or simply those who felt a profound call to a different kind of life. For such women, the convent offered not just support, but also a sense of belonging and purpose that might have been difficult to find elsewhere. They were integrated into a functional community, given roles and responsibilities that contributed to the collective good, and treated with dignity and respect as members of the sisterhood. In essence, the convent provided a comprehensive social safety net and an enduring community that offered both practical and emotional support. It was a place where women were cared for in illness and old age, where their spiritual and emotional needs were attended to, and where they found a lasting sense of belonging and sisterhood. This collective living, bound by common purpose and rule, offered a level of stability, companionship, and mutual aid that was often absent or highly precarious in the often harsh and individualistic medieval secular world. Number 4. Economic stability and a full belly. For the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, life was an unrelenting struggle against economic insecurity and the constant threat of scarcity. The majority of the population were peasants, tied to the land they worked, often under feudal obligations to a lord. Their sustenance depended almost entirely on the success of the harvest, which in turn relied on unpredictable weather patterns. A single bad harvest, brought on by drought, excessive rain, or unseasonal frost, could mean widespread hunger, even starvation. Famines were not uncommon events, and they could decimate entire villages. Even in good years, the diet of a peasant was monotonous and meager, consisting primarily of grains, vegetables, and legumes, with meat being a rare luxury. They lived at the subsistence level, with little surplus, and debt was a common burden. For women in particular, economic vulnerability was often heightened. A peasant woman's labor was essential to the family's survival, working alongside men in the fields, but also managing the household, raising children, and engaging in domestic industries like spinning and weaving. If her husband died, leaving her a widow, her economic position could become dire, as she might lose access to land or be forced to support herself and her children on meager earnings. Even for women in higher social strata, such as daughters of minor nobility or merchants, their economic security was often contingent on their family's wealth and their ability to secure a suitable marriage. Without a dowry, or if a family faced financial ruin, a woman's prospects could collapse, leaving her dependent on charity, or facing a life of servitude. The medieval world offered few robust social safety nets for those who fell through the cracks. Poverty was often a brutal reality, marked by constant anxiety over food, shelter, and survival. In striking contrast, entering a convent offered a remarkable degree of economic stability and material security that was simply out of reach for most people. Once a woman took her vows, she was guaranteed sustenance for life. This included regular meals, secure shelter, and adequate clothing. Convents were not just places of prayer. They were complex economic entities, often endowed with significant landholdings, rents, and other forms of wealth by pious patrons. These endowments provided a stable, ongoing income that insulated the convent community from the immediate fluctuations of the wider economy. Many convents operated as self-sufficient agricultural units. They owned fields, raised livestock, cultivated vineyards, and maintained extensive gardens. Nuns and often lay sisters or hired laborers under their supervision would be involved in the production of food, from planting and harvesting crops to milling grain, baking bread, and brewing ale. This direct control over food production meant that even in times of regional scarcity, a well-managed convent often had reserves and the ability to feed its community. Historical records, such as account books from convents like Barking Abbey in England, detail the impressive scale of their agricultural operations and the variety of foodstuffs produced or purchased, indicating a diet often superior in quality and consistency to that of common peasants. The meals provided in the refectory, while perhaps simple by modern standards and subject to dietary restrictions, like abstaining from meat on certain days, were regular and generally nutritious. They provided a consistent intake of calories and essential nutrients, unlike the feast or famine existence of many outside the cloister. A nun did not need to worry about where her next meal would come from, or if she would have enough food to survive the winter. This freedom from constant hunger and food anxiety was a profound benefit, allowing nuns to focus on their spiritual and intellectual pursuits rather than the ceaseless grind of material survival beyond food. Convents also provided secure housing. The monastic buildings were often substantial, providing warm and dry shelter, a stark contrast to the often flimsy and crowded dwellings of peasants. Each nun had a bed, sometimes in a shared dormitory or for abbesses or more senior nuns in private cells. They were also provided with clothing, often simple woolen habits which, while not luxurious, were practical, durable, and regularly maintained. The communal nature of the convent meant that resources were pooled and shared, ensuring that all members had their basic needs met. Furthermore, convents often had infirmaries, dedicated spaces for the sick and elderly sisters. This meant that nuns received care when they were ill, including food tailored to their needs, and sometimes access to herbal medicines cultivated in the convent's own gardens or purchased from apothecaries. This level of health care, rudimentary as it was by modern standards, was a significant advantage over the ad hoc care often available in the secular world, where illness could quickly lead to destitution and death for those without family support or resources. The financial stability of the convent ensured that its members were cared for from their entrance until their death, providing a sense of long-term security. In essence, a nun's life represented a secure escape from the pervasive economic uncertainty and material hardship that characterized the medieval world for most people. While she renounced personal wealth, she gained access to a well-resourced, self-sufficient institution that guaranteed her basic needs for life: food, shelter, clothing, and care in sickness and old age. This economic stability provided a bedrock of security, freeing women from the daily anxieties of survival and allowing them to pursue a life of devotion and study, a luxury that was far removed from the daily reality of the vast majority of their secular counterparts. Number 3. Authority, management, and leadership broach. In the medieval secular world, opportunities for women to hold formal authority, particularly beyond the domestic sphere, were exceedingly rare and usually tied to extraordinary circumstances of birth or widowhood. A queen might rule as a regent for a young son, or a powerful noblewoman might manage her household and estates in her husband's absence. But her power was almost always derived from her relationship to a man not held independently. Women were largely excluded from legal, political, and ecclesiastical offices. They could not serve as judges, clerks, knights, or priests. Their voices carried little weight in public assemblies or courts of law. For the vast majority of women, their sphere of influence was restricted to the family, the immediate household, or informal social networks. They might have a significant impact within their homes, but their authority rarely extended to managing large estates, overseeing significant financial transactions, or governing large numbers of people in a formal capacity. Even for women of the nobility, who might own land through inheritance, their property was often managed by male relatives or stewards. Legal conventions often limited their ability to act as independent agents in property matters, requiring the consent of a male guardian or husband. Public leadership was almost exclusively a male domain, with positions of power vested in kings, feudal lords, bishops, and other male officials. The very concept of a woman as a formal manager or leader of a significant institution was generally contrary to the prevailing patriarchal social norms. Within the convent, however, a strikingly different reality existed, particularly for those who ascended to the position of abbess. An abbess was a formidable figure, a powerful leader in her own right, wielding both spiritual and temporal authority. She governed a community that could range from a few dozen to several hundred nuns, novices, and lay sisters. Her responsibilities were vast and multifaceted, encompassing spiritual leadership, financial administration, and the management of extensive estates. The abbess was responsible for the spiritual well-being of her community. She oversaw the strict adherence to the monastic rule, guided the nuns in their prayers and spiritual practices, and served as a moral exemplar. She was the final authority on internal discipline and the spiritual development of each sister. This spiritual authority was paramount, placing her in a position of immense respect and responsibility within the church structure, even if she was technically subordinate to a male bishop. Beyond spiritual guidance, an abbess was also a major landowner and an economic powerhouse. Many convents were endowed with vast properties, including arable land, forests, mills, and entire villages. The abbess was responsible for managing these estates, which could be extensive and spread across several counties. This involved overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents and feudal dues from tenants, negotiating leases, and ensuring the efficient operation of mills and other convent assets. She had to understand land management, accounting, and legal contracts. The wealth of some abbeys was considerable, comparable to that of powerful secular lords. Examples abound of abbesses who wielded significant temporal power. Matilda of Quedlinburg, a 10th century abbess, for instance, was a princess of the Ottonian dynasty and governed an imperial abbey that held lands and judicial rights comparable to a principality. She presided over diets, assemblies of the Holy Roman Empire, minted her own coins, and commanded her own contingent of troops. Her authority extended beyond the cloister walls, making her a significant political player in her realm. While Quedlinburg was exceptional, many other abbesses held similar, if less grand, authority over their endowments, managing their lands, people, and finances with considerable autonomy. They engaged in legal disputes to protect their convent's rights, negotiated with local lords and bishops, and made significant economic decisions that affected hundreds, if not thousands, of people living on their lands. The abbess also oversaw the internal administration of the convent itself. This involved managing the convent's budget, supervising the infirmary, directing the work in the scriptorium, overseeing the purchase of supplies, and managing the domestic staff or lay sisters. She was responsible for the maintenance and repair of the monastic buildings, which often included complex architectural projects. This required significant organizational skills, financial acumen, and the ability to delegate and supervise effectively. The roles of prioress, sub-prioress, and other conventual officials served under her, creating a clear administrative hierarchy that provided opportunities for other nuns to develop leadership and management skills, even if they did not become abbesses. The position of abbess offered women a unique and powerful form of public authority, a scope of influence that was virtually unattainable for women outside the monastic system. They were not just spiritual leaders, but also astute administrators, property managers, and sometimes even political figures. This presented an unparalleled opportunity for women to exercise their intelligence, organizational skills, and leadership capabilities in a formal and recognized capacity. It challenged the prevailing societal norms that restricted women to the private sphere, demonstrating that women were fully capable of governing, managing resources, and leading large institutions with competence and authority. Convent, therefore, provided a pathway for exceptional women to rise to positions of immense power and responsibility, making decisions that impacted not only their immediate community, but also broader regional economies. Number 2, safety and security from the chaotic world. The medieval world was for many a place of profound insecurity and constant threat. Beyond the cloister walls, life was often brutal, short, and unpredictable. Feudal warfare was a pervasive feature of the landscape. Lords frequently engaged in disputes over land power and prestige, leading to skirmishes, sieges, and outright battles that devastated the countryside. Peasants, caught between warring factions, often saw their homes burned, crops destroyed, and livestock plundered. Women were particularly vulnerable during these conflicts, facing the threats of abduction, rape, and forced displacement. Even in times of peace, banditry was a serious problem. Roaming bands of desperate men, often demobilized soldiers or outlaws, preyed on travelers and isolated communities, making travel dangerous and rendering remote areas insecure. Beyond human conflict, the natural world presented its own set of terrifying challenges. Famines, caused by prolonged droughts, excessive floods, or severe winters, were recurrent events that could decimate populations, leading to widespread starvation and disease. The Great Famine of the early 14th century, for example, killed millions across Europe. Disease was another constant, pervasive threat. Basic sanitation was poor, medical knowledge was limited, and understanding of contagion was virtually non-existent. Epidemics, such as outbreaks of dysentery, influenza, and particularly the Black Death in the mid-14th century, swept through towns and villages with terrifying speed and lethality. The Black Death alone is estimated to have killed between 30 to 50% of Europe's population, leaving unimaginable devastation in its wake. There was little defense against these invisible killers. Entire families and communities could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. Life expectancy was low, and death could come suddenly and violently from war, crime, famine, or illness at any age. For women in the secular world, these threats were amplified by their generally more vulnerable position. They were more susceptible to violence in times of conflict and less able to defend themselves. The constant burden of childbearing also made them particularly susceptible to illness and death. The sense of precariousness of living at the mercy of unpredictable forces was a defining characteristic of medieval existence for the vast majority of people. There was no overarching state or police force to guarantee safety, no organized public health system to combat disease, and no comprehensive social security to alleviate the impact of famine. Survival often depended on luck, local circumstances, and the protection afforded by a strong lord or family unit. Convent, in stark contrast, offered a deliberate and often effective sanctuary from many of these external perils. The physical architecture of a monastery or convent often served as a robust barrier against threats. Cloister walls were typically high and sturdy, providing a degree of fortification against roaming bandits or even smaller raiding parties during times of conflict. Many convents were situated in relatively secluded locations, reducing their exposure to the direct pathways of war and trade routes that often carried disease and danger. Inside these walls, the threat of physical violence from outsiders was significantly reduced, and internal conflict was strictly managed by the monastic rule and the authority of the abbess. Nuns could live out their days in relative peace, undisturbed by the constant anxieties of personal safety that plagued so many others. During periods of widespread warfare, convents often became places of refuge, not only for their own inhabitants, but sometimes for women and children from the surrounding communities seeking protection. The sacred nature of monastic institutions sometimes afforded them a degree of immunity from attack by warring factions, though this was not always guaranteed. Nevertheless, the physical enclosure provided a tangible measure of security that was largely absent elsewhere. While not entirely immune to epidemics, convents often fared better than crowded, unsanitary towns. Their structured routines, emphasis on cleanliness relative to the times, and often better access to fresh water and food could offer a measure of protection against the spread of disease. Infirmaries provided dedicated care for the sick, preventing illness from spreading unchecked through the community and offering a level of nursing that was superior to what most people received at home. The communal living, while potentially a vector for disease, also meant that sick individuals were cared for and isolated, which could limit outbreaks. Beyond physical security, the convent provided a profound sense of psychological and spiritual security. The regular rhythm of prayer, study, and work created an orderly and predictable existence in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. This structure provided comfort and stability. The spiritual commitment to God also offered a sense of purpose and divine protection, believing that their lives were guided by a higher power and that their eternal salvation was assured. This spiritual peace was a powerful antidote to the existential anxieties that pervaded medieval life. A nun, having renounced the world, symbolically placed herself under divine protection, freeing herself from many of the worldly worries that tormented her secular counterparts. In essence, The monastic life offered a sheltered existence, a deliberate withdrawal from the chaotic and often violent realities of the medieval world. Convent walls provided a physical and spiritual fortress against war, crime, famine, and disease. While no place was entirely without risk, the institutional structure of the convent, its resources, and its physical defenses offered its inhabitants a degree of safety, security, and peace of mind that was a rare and precious commodity in a period often defined by its perils. Number 1. A path to personal and spiritual fulfillment. For the vast majority of women in the medieval period, life was largely dictated by societal expectations and gender roles that offered little room for personal autonomy or individual spiritual exploration beyond conventional piety. A woman's identity was primarily defined by her relationships to men, first as a daughter, then almost inevitably as a wife, and finally, and most importantly, as a mother. Her purpose was often seen as serving her family, maintaining the household, and bearing children. While these roles were undoubtedly vital and held intrinsic value, they often left little space for a woman to cultivate her own inner life, pursue intellectual interests, or seek a profound spiritual connection that transcended the domestic sphere. The demands of daily survival, constant labor, and the ever-present cycle of childbearing and rearing consumed most of a woman's time and energy. Spiritual devotion often took the form of attending Mass, saying simple prayers, and observing religious holidays, but rarely extended to deep theological study, mystical contemplation, or active participation in the intellectual life of the Church. The secular world, with its focus on marriage, lineage, and material accumulation, could offer a fulfilling life for some, but it did not provide an institutionalized path for women to dedicate their entire existence to spiritual proof from domestic and familial obligations. A woman might have a strong faith, but her opportunities to express or deepen it, beyond a private capacity, were limited. Her worth was often measured by her fertility, her obedience, and her ability to manage a household efficiently, rather than by her spiritual insight, intellectual prowess, or artistic creativity. Within the convent, however, a woman could embark on a life fundamentally dedicated to God, offering a profound sense of purpose and a unique pathway to personal and spiritual fulfillment. The entire monastic existence was structured around the pursuit of holiness and a deeper relationship with the divine. The daily rhythm of the divine office, with its communal prayers, psalms, and readings, provided a continuous framework for spiritual growth and contemplation. Nuns spent hours each day in prayer, meditation, and spiritual reading, cultivating an interior life that was often unattainable for women immersed in the demands of secular existence. This constant engagement with sacred texts and spiritual practices allowed for deep introspection and a profound exploration of their faith. Moreover, the convent provided a unique environment where women could engage in forms of spiritual expression and service that went beyond domestic duties. Many convents fostered vibrant, artistic, and intellectual pursuits, all seen as forms of worship. Nuns were involved in the creation of illuminated manuscripts, where they expressed their devotion through intricate artwork and calligraphy. They composed hymns and chants, contributing to the rich tradition of sacred music. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned earlier, exemplified this, not only through her extraordinary intellectual output, but also through her visionary experiences and musical compositions. For women with artistic talents, the convent offered a legitimate outlet and encouragement for their creativity, allowing them to produce works that glorified God and enriched the cultural landscape. The concept of becoming a bride of Christ was not merely symbolic. It was a powerful theological and personal transformation. By taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a nun effectively transcended the limitations of her earthly gender roles and entered into a spiritual union that offered a unique form of empowerment and spiritual liberation. She was no longer defined by her relationship to a mortal man, but by her direct relationship with the divine. This allowed for a profound sense of personal dignity and individual worth derived from her spiritual vocation, rather than her social or marital status. It elevated her beyond the domestic sphere and gave her a purpose that was both deeply personal and universally significant. Nuns also engaged in acts of charity and service within their communities. Many convents operated infirmaries for the sick, hospices for the poor, and travelers or schools for young girls. Through these activities, nuns directly contributed to the well-being of others, embodying the Christian ideal of charity and finding fulfillment in selfless service. These roles provided a tangible sense of purpose and contribution to society, giving their lives meaning beyond personal gratification. Contemplative life offered by the convent allowed for deep intellectual and theological study. For women with inquisitive minds, the ability to delve into Scripture, the writings of the Church Fathers and theological treatises provided immense intellectual satisfaction and a deeper understanding of their faith. This intellectual engagement was itself a form of spiritual fulfillment, a means of connecting with God through the mind. The quiet, solitude, and structured routine of the cloister provided the ideal conditions for such profound personal and spiritual development, allowing women to nurture their souls and minds in ways that were often impossible in the bustling, demanding secular world. In essence, the convent offered medieval women a profound and multifaceted path to personal and spiritual fulfillment. It provided an institutionalized space where women could dedicate their entire lives to God, pursue deep spiritual growth, engage in intellectual and artistic endeavors, and find a sense of purpose through service. This commitment offered an identity rooted in their spiritual vocation, providing a unique form of empowerment and an avenue for cultivating their inner lives and talents, a luxury of personal and spiritual exploration that was lives were often defined by the strictures of marriage and the relentless demands of the medieval household.